Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing you another really awesome guest involved in creating a better tomorrow for all of us. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Professor Carlos Duarte, who is the Distinguished Professor in Marine Science and Executive Director of the Coral Research and Development Accelerator platform. That's part of the Biological and Environmental Science and Engineering Division at King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi. He also serves as the chief scientist of Oceans 2050, Oceans US, and the E1 series programs related to this. Prior to these roles, Professor Duarte was a research professor with the Spanish National Research Council and the director of the Oceans Institute at the University of Western Australia. He also holds honorary positions in the Arctic Research Center at Aarhus University in Denmark and Oceans Institute at the University of Western Australia. And his research has focused over the years on understanding the effects of global change in marine ecosystems, developing the so-called nature-based solutions to global challenges, including climate change, and developing various evidence-based strategies to rebuild the abundance of marine life by 2050. His research in areas like mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes led to ultimately the development of, working with the United Nations, the concept of blue carbon. He led the Malaspina 2010 expedition, which sailed all over the world's oceans, looking at various impacts of climate change and exploring deep sea biodiversity. He's extensively published. We will put the extensive bio in the bio of the show, but we're honored to have him with us today. Professor Carlos Duarte, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today for a little while.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to join you today. Thank you for the invitation.
It's wonderful having you. Let's start off, if we could, back in 1987, because it is at this point you did your undergraduate degree at the Autonomous University of Madrid in Spain. You went off to Canada to McGill, and in 1987 you published your Ph.D., which is entitled Biomass and Distribution of Submerged Macrophytes in Lakes. Taking a look at your work, I mean, at this time, you sort of create a microcosm for what you're going to be getting into and what we're going to be talking about later, in the sense looking at aquatic plants and lakes, phytoplankton, what happens with nutrient runoff and temperature, light intensity. I learned about morphometry of the lake. Take us back to 1987, if you would, and a little bit of the early days when you first got started on this really fascinating journey you've been on.
Yeah, no, so as you indicated, my PhD was on the field of limnology, which many people don't know what it stands for, but it's the study of inland aquatic systems. So that's rivers, lakes, reservoirs, springs, groundwater, all of that is folded under limnology. And of course, in the 1980s, the context of research on environment and ecology was very different from what it is today. So, for instance, we didn't have the World Wide Web. There was no internet. I was typing my papers and my thesis on a typewriter. And then when submitting the papers to a journal, we had to send them by snail mail, put in an envelope, kiss goodbye, and maybe some 6 months later, we'll have something back. So it was a very different way of doing science. And also because of the lack of connectivity through the internet, there was very little awareness of global processes. in any case, already in my research, I was concerned not only with the lakes that I was studying, but I was interested to learn if there were some general rules that govern the functioning of lakes globally. So I still did a lot of global work, and I started to develop that mindset of global ecology, which has really guided my work for 40 years.
Excellent. And as you were just saying, you move from the field of limnology and the inland lakes, and you start publishing quite
Yeah,
extensively following your dissertation on various aspects of seagrass ecology,
yeah,
genetics, population biology, all sorts of things with regard to biogeochemical cycles. Um, Before we get to the United Nations and 2009 and blue carbon, talk a little bit about your work in this area, because I did a little just reading just so I could hang in there with
yeah,
you on the topic. Learned interesting facts that I didn't know, that sea grasses actually didn't come from the sea. They were grasses that started on land and made their way back to the sea, which was quite
yeah,
interesting. Only
yeah.
flowering plants that live in the ocean. Talk a little bit about what we're talking about there, because I sort of, we have the mangrove, which is near the show. We got the reef out here, which we'll be getting to. Seagrass is sort of this area in between. Take us into your work here, if you would.
So, as we were discussing earlier, my PhD thesis work was about aquatic plants in lakes and rivers, and those are actually the ancestors of the seagrass. And of course, then the ocean where the seagrass thrive is sitting downstream from these lakes and rivers. So it was only natural for me to follow the flow and eventually encounter seagrass as the descendants of aquatic plants. In fact, all of them originated from aquatic inland plant ancestors, and there are very close connections between some, in terms of evolution and genomics, between some inland aquatic plants and seagrass. So, moving from a lake with aquatic plants to a much larger lake, which is the ocean with also plants, wasn't really a big jump, but it was almost a natural flow. And then when I then arrived to work on the ocean, I relocated from Canada to Spain, where then I started work on marine science, and then seagrass was the closest connection between the work I was doing before on aquatic plants and the ocean. So that was kind of my entry point to ocean. And at that point, there wasn't really much interest in seagrass, not only in terms of research and understanding their ecology and evolution, but even on their conservation. And many years later, like I think in the 2008, I published a paper where I nicknamed seagrass the ugly ducklings of environmental conservation, because at that point, still nearly 30 years after I started working on them, not even NGOs care about seagrass, and the general public care even less. There was very little awareness of what those ecosystems were. They were often confounded with seaweed and something that is nasty and not nice. And then there was a lot of work to understand what useful services these ecosystems provide, how important they are for biodiversity, how important they are for the ocean and for us. And I think that in nearly 40 years of work, we have really flipped that negative perception of seagrass to celebrate them as very important ecosystems that we care about.
And no longer than ugly duckling,
Yeah.
for sure. Um, yeah, no, so 2009 comes along, and this is where you publish sort of the seminal report with the United Nations Environment Program entitled "Blue Carbon: The Role of Healthy Oceans in Binding Carbon: A Rapid Response Assessment," introducing this very important theme of the sink, or the blue carbon sink, and this extremely critical role of both oceans and the ecosystems that they hold in capturing carbon. And you make a point. This has been vastly overlooked. We think so much of sort of terrestrial biomass. We don't think as much of the much larger abundance of biomass that's under the water. Talk about 2009. What were some of the learnings and that came out
Yeah.
of this particular report, and sort of the excitement that was generated by it?
Yeah. So 2009 is really rooted on work that I did in the 1990s and early 2000s. So as I started to look at seagrass and also other coastal ecosystems, including mangroves, salt-marshes, and kelp forest, then my initial research led to finding that these ecosystems are the most intense carbon sinks in the biosphere. So they are highly productive, and as they produce massive amounts of organic matter through photosynthesis, despite being underwater, they also have a capacity to filter out particles from the water column, then deposit them in the seabed, and then lock them in the seabed where these particles and the carbon associated accumulates over years. So I published the first seminal paper on the role of these habitats as what we call autotrophic ecosystems. That means that they produce excess organic carbon that
Mm-hmm.
is not used and accumulates. And then I then was busy trying to understand why these ecosystems were able to support that phenomenal capacity for carbon removal. So then, during maybe 7 or 8 years, I was working on the mechanisms that lead to that, which are multiple. First of all, the organic matter they produce is very resistant to microbial degradation, so it's
Mm-hmm.
very hard to break down and degrade as CO2 back to the atmosphere. Second, in these aquatic habitats and marine habitats, the seafloor lacks oxygen, so the oxygen is lost just a few millimeters below the surface of the soil. So when these carbon particles actually are deposited in the sediments, they're rapidly buried with very little oxygen. That therefore means that it's very hard for microbes to degrade them. Not only because they are inherently difficult to degrade, but also because the lack of oxygen then leads to very inefficient microbial processes. So that also leads to the accumulation. But also these habitats have the capacity to, as I mentioned earlier, to trap particles from the water flow and also reduce the energy of waves and other physical forces and currents. And therefore, once the carbon goes into the soil, it is safely locked in there. And the last element that is very different in terms of other habitats, which seems like a no-brainer, but it took quite a bit of time for people working on forests to understand, is that there are no fires underwater. So therefore, once the carbon is nicely buried in the soil, is safely deposited there for millenary timescales. Whereas in forest, every 100 years or so, there will be a wildfire that burns the biomass, burns the carbon, and returns it to the atmosphere. So that means that these carbon sinks can accumulate safely carbon for thousands of years. So I worked for about 15 years to publish all of this work, and then some work was coming out from some other colleagues. And in the summer of 2009, then I was contacted as I was heading to holidays by UN officers that had been reading my work, and they saw an opportunity to strike two wins with one strategy, which was that up to now they were also frustrated that even though these habitats were experiencing significant global losses, there was very little interest and energy from the conservation movement to take care of these habitats. So they had not been able to mobilize organizations to deploy conservation programs for seagrass, mangroves, and salt marshes, particularly seagrass. And at the same time, the world was heading to a convention of the parties, a COP, in Copenhagen, where there was
Mm-hmm.
the ambition that there was going to be a climate agreement. Now we had to wait 6 years until the Paris Agreement for this climate deal to be made. But in 2009, everybody expected that there would be some sort of agreement in Copenhagen. So they saw an opportunity to put together a report based on my science that showed that these ecosystems can help us mitigate climate change if we avoid further losses and restore them. And in the same time, then we mobilize resources to avoid the type of losses that these habitats were suffering. So rather than go on a holiday, I spent my days writing this report, of which I wrote the bulk of the core of the report, and then my co-authors then added a general framework of the carbon budget of the biosphere to frame how this sits, and also at the end some policy recommendations of how to translate this opportunity into policies that will mitigate climate change by conserving and restoring these habitats. Unfortunately, then in 2009 there was no deal yet, but in any case, a number of nations were already deploying restoration projects, particularly for mangroves, at a scale. The motivation of these countries had nothing to do with climate change, and those were countries in the Indian Ocean like Indonesia, Thailand, and India, because in 2004, a major tsunami in the Indian Ocean led to the loss of 250,000 lives. And then in the rapid assessment of the impacts, it was immediately evident that the communities that retain a pocket of mangrove between the village of the city and the ocean actually were spared from the losses. There were almost no human casualties for those communities, and even infrastructure loss was much, much reduced. So the benefits of these habitats for coastal protection became very evident, and that led to major afforestation projects being deployed in the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. So by the time we released our report, many countries were already embarked in large-scale afforestation projects, but they had never thought about the climate benefits of those projects, and that with those climate benefits, they could also resource their projects from carbon credits. So that resonated strongly with these nations, and there was a very rapid uptake of the concept.
Outstanding, really outstanding. The next year, come 2010, the Malaspina circumnavigation expedition begins, and you lead this. Hundreds of scientists. I think it goes out for 2 years. And you're looking at many things, but specifically one of the ones that I like to go into is the deep sea ecosystems. And as a couple, probably a couple of months ago, we had Craig Venter on talking about his expedition, capturing things at the surface and various at every couple hundred miles around the globe. You went quite deep, and one of the focuses here was areas over 3,000 meters deep. You point out, we know more about Mars than we do about what's down there. Talk a little bit about this and a little bit about how, because I guess, ran into the same thing. When it comes to some of these odd organisms, and if we didn't have the genomic tools to really sequence them or analyze them, if we brought them up, there is not much we could do back in the day. But now, with the evolution of the genomic techniques and so forth, talk a little bit about how that allowed you to really take advantage of what you brought up from this expedition.
Yeah, so this expedition was the largest project that I've ever designed and run. And everybody told me that it was impossible to do what I pledged to do. So one of the lessons I learned from this expedition, but I have practiced since, is that you never should stop on your dreams because somebody tells you that it's impossible, particularly when it is about scientific dreams, because science is the tool that we humans use to turn the impossible possible and redefine the boundaries of what is possible. But in this case, it was certainly a logistic challenge to organize this. So we took sail with two vessels, two ocean-going research vessels. One of them, it was used as a floating university, and it conducted a 3-month cruise from Spain to the Caribbean and back, conducting research projects of master students. So it was a floating university, and the other vessel then sailed around the world for 9 months. Probing into the deep sea, but also looking at how climate change and global change were impacting on the oceans while we explore its biodiversity. And we also had two other goals. One was to celebrate the original expedition of Alejandro Malaspina, which sailed the oceans for the first time. So the Spanish The Spanish crown has been in the business of circumnavigating for 500 years, since Magellan. And the first scientific expedition was run by Alejandro Malaspina in the late 1700s. And then we wanted to celebrate their contributions, which are very poorly known relative to other expeditions, and also recover some of the materials that were lost after the expedition, which we greatly recovered. And then we also wanted to train a new generation of scientists with a global understanding of problems and also the capacity to engage in very broad and ambitious collaborations. So that was all of this suite of goals were part of the expedition. And then, as you mentioned, a few years earlier, Craig Benter led the Sorcerer 2 expedition
Right.
with a sailboat. And they, for the first time, they applied what we call metagenomics using something called shotgun sequencing, which basically involves filtering particles from a parcel of water into a filter, then extracting all of the DNA present in that filter, and then sequencing the hell out of it. And then when you have all of those sequences of parts of genomes, then start classifying the genes, their functions, and then apportioning them to the organisms that are present. So now metagenomics is the workhorse of genomic analysis at the ecosystem level, but at the time it was hugely expensive. So when I proposed to my research team that we eventually involved about 800 scientists in the project, that we were going to conduct a full genome sequencing effort at the ocean scale of the deep sea, then they told me that was impossible. And it was crazy to be even able to think about that. Because at the time we calculated that the cost of the project would be about, if I remember correctly, about 200 million US dollars to sequence everything that we were to collect. And we only had a fraction of that, even for operational cost, not even 10% of that for operational cost. But I kept arguing that the important element is to have the collection of samples, and then we will figure out a way to get the resources to sequence them. I was at the time expecting that the cost of sequencing will decline according to the Moore's law. That is the law that predicts the decline in the cost of computing power. But then due to technological breakthroughs, as we were preparing to sail, then the cost of sequencing declined by a factor of 4,000-fold. From the time we planned the expedition to the time that we came back with the sample, so that rather than 200 million, we needed something like, and in fact, we did a lot more sequencing than we originally planned for. We needed 300,000. And therefore, we then went ahead and did all of the sequencing work. And this remains still the major reference database for deep sea genomics. And in fact, this year we published a global catalog of the ocean genome. And most of the deep sea components of the catalog still come from the Malaspina expedition. We have published by now nearly 400 scientific papers, some of them with really major breakthroughs, like, for instance, the first inventory of plastics in the ocean and many others. And then we continue to publish papers, but now the whole community publishes based on the Malaspina data because it's open source to everybody. And I take a great pleasure in seeing how this has become the key resource to understanding the genomic resources of the deep sea.
Yeah. One of those papers, which was in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, was entitled "What Lies Underneath Conserving the Ocean's Genetic Resources," and this was September of 2010. And then there was another. I mean, this was after, but in October 2014, another paper. This was "Biotechnology Advances: A Global Imbalance in Seaweed Production Research Effort and Biotechnology Markets," and they both have sort of this similar background theme about bioprospecting. And this is a area I spent a little time in my former career. I come out of pharmaceutical industry, and as you know, and I like to stress on the show that a lot of the current pharmaceutical industry industry is, based on natural products that come from either plants or fungi or bacteria. And when I was at SmithKline, we actually had a team in Spain. This was back in I think it was the 80s, that used to go scuba diving and look for interesting
Yeah.
creatures and stuff like that. Talk a little bit about, I mean, clearly, you always hear that there's a lot that we have not explored of the natural
Mm.
biodiversity on land, let alone what's under the waters. What have you seen? I mean, whether it's pharmaceuticals, industrial enzymes, blue chemistry,
Mm.
obviously there's a treasure trove here. Issues, of course, regarding patentability and
Yeah.
the country's intellectual property and all that. But put that into a little bit, whether we're dealing with stuff at 3,000 meters or seaweed, we have a lot to still discover here.
Yeah. So I will start with a very broad picture and then dive into the question. But the broad picture is that in the 21st century, we have an opportunity to change the way we interact with the ocean in terms of deriving value from the ocean. That is called the new blue economy. So the concept of the blue economy is not similar to the maritime economy, which is business as usual,
Right.
and typically strictly for shipping, oil and gas, fisheries, and so on. The new blue economy is a new approach to deriving value from the ocean that posits that deriving value from the ocean is compatible with ocean conservation and sustainable use of the ocean. So it is emerging as a result of different pillars that generate economic value without extracting from the ocean or doing so in ways that are compatible with a healthy ocean. So the pillars involve natural capital. In fact, natural capital is the next step after blue carbon. So blue carbon is the first time that the private sector can invest in oceans, not to extract from it, but actually to repair and conserve. And then if we take that approach further, it's not only about carbon, it's about many benefits that we receive from ocean ecosystems. So that a class of ocean ecosystems that generate the benefits that we use to support our well-being is called natural capital. So blue natural capital, and that's a tagline that I've used in several talks, is the new real estate of the ocean. And it's an investable asset class. So that's one pillar of the blue economy. The second one is marine genes and natural products, and that's a new industry that emerges actually with the capacity to sequence and do bioinformatics to eventually classify genes into functions, but also to be able to insert those genes and engineer bacteria to be able to perform those functions and therefore catalyze the industry of blue biotechnology. So the blue biotechnology industry is one that starts this century. It didn't exist before, and then grows very rapidly with the new advent of the sequencing technologies, and then metabolomics, proteomics, and synthetic biology. To then, by 2010, it was already worth about $10 billion per year, and is growing very rapidly. So as we prepare to sail the oceans and extract genomes and genes from the ocean, then I ask myself, because most of our work was in the high seas, I asked myself, so who owns these resources? And then we published the paper that you referred to, where we did a lot of programming and a lot of reconciling data from the International Patent Office and data from a genomic database to match the two. And we found that 10 nations only own about 90% of all the patents on marine genes, which at the time there were about 5,000 patents on marine genes for many, many functions that we are all very familiar with, but we are not aware that those are powered from the ocean. So I will probably come up to some examples. But anyway, we found that 10 nations own 90% of all the patents, and the top three own 70% of all the patents.
Sure.
So there was a high concentration of intellectual property derived from the ocean into a few nations, and then 160 nations did not own a single patent. And yet the ocean and the high seas is a pool resource. So that paper led to a process that has taken a long time to come to fruition in the UN, which is a process under the UN Law of the Sea, which for which last year there was finally an agreement reached, and it's called Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions.
Okay.
And the acronym we use is BBNJ. So that agreement last year, for the first time, establishes a mechanism to share the benefits of the genetic resources of the high seas. So that it's taken over 12 years since we published our paper, but we're happy to see that problem addressed. There's probably a lot of room for improvement in the framework that has been designed, but it's an important one. And the second thing is that we also notice a loophole between the biodiversity laws, which, for instance, give ownership of genetic resources to the custodian of the economic exclusive zone where the resources might be found.
Right.
That's called the Nagoya Protocol. But the International Patent Office created a loophole because to patent a gene sequence, you did not have to disclose where which was the nature of the organism from which the gene came from, nor where were the organism sampled or obtained. So then, regardless of the Nagoya Protocol, you could continue to patent the gene sequences in the International Patent Office without any consideration or disclosure of where it came from and what type of organism that was. So that has actually also been closed this year. So this year, the World International Patent Office has International Property Organization, has released a new agreement that mandates that any digital gene sequence that is submitted for patent needs to come with a disclosure of the nature of the organism and where it came from. So now the two processes, biodiversity and intellectual property management, are reconciled, and now we can deliver the whole promise of this new resource called blue biotechnology, with the understanding that now we have a solid framework to operate. In fact, the work that we did on who owns marine genes, which was the original title of the paper that we published, but the editor imposed a change to a more neutral title. Then was further taken on by another group who actually look into not just in which countries the IP sits, but who actually owns them. And they found that a corporation called BASF, which is a chemical corporation from Germany, owned half of all of the gene patents in the ocean. So that is certainly one corporation then appropriating what should be a global resource.
Right. No, it's an elegant piece of work, and again, thinking back to the pharmaceutical industry, and natural products were always, let's put it this way, the fancy word, whether it was combinatorial chemistry or SAR, or now with AI, you wonder, at the end of the day, I'd make a bet on the natural world making more creative structures, but it's nice to see it there, and what you put together, and the way you've cataloged it all and thought about it. But that's
so now this year, as I mentioned earlier, this year we released first gene catalog for the ocean, and we are now about to release a gene catalog for the biosphere.
nice.
So that's what I'm working on that paper actually this week.
Excellent.
So this now we're not looking just at the ocean, but we're looking at the whole biosphere. So sequences of airborne microorganisms, soils, plants, fresh water, even human environments like maybe factories, hospitals, households, wastewater, everything. So in that catalog, we are releasing 640 billion genes, unique genes. So that is quite a big haystack. And now the difficulty is, how do you find the needles that can power the blue biotechnology in that massive haystack? So we're starting to use advanced AI to be able to predict which genes can perform which functions that might be of industrial interest, and also use AI to assemble genomes from all of these massed amount of single genes.
Excellent. Excellent. That's awesome.
Hmm.
Cause you joined the biological and environmental science and engineering division in 2015, Red Sea Research Center, and then became the director in 2016. Um, we spent a little time a couple of years ago with one of your colleagues, Mark Tester, working on the saltwater
Yeah.
agriculture component of what's happening there. Before we get into Port Up, can you just reintroduce us to KAUST and a little bit of how you got? I mean, it's a beautiful campus behind you there. Talk just a little bit about the university and a little bit about
Yeah.
ultimately how you arrived there.
Yeah, so in fact, my background is actually a photograph of cows seen from the campus at night. So we have a
Nice.
beautiful campus that is an architecture award-winning campus. We're a very small university of science and technology, only 220 faculty, which is probably the size of a university department in a regular university. So very small, very focused, very targeted, very carefully selected faculty. So I think there's a lot of talent here, highly international. And in addition to the amazing resources that we have available to conduct our research, I don't think there's any other university with the same unique pool of high class infrastructure as we have. Then our university is unique in that usually most frameworks, then faculty and professors need to resource their research by writing grants, applications to funding agencies, and eventually get them funded. And in many research systems, that process of writing the grant and administering the grant and then writing reports might well consume about 70% of the time of the scientist. So what is the point of recruiting what might be or the best possible scientists when you're going to board them to do administrative work for more than two-thirds of their time? So what this university has done is that it was established with a huge endowment set by the King Abdullah, which is the founding king of the university. Then that endowment is governed by our board of trustees, and then it resources all of the work that we do. We also have external research funds, but that means that I am free from the typical constraints of my colleagues to have to write grants to be able to resource my research. So we have a nice model that is a 5-year rolling contract. So I'm distinguished professor of marine science, but even regardless of how distinguished I may be, I don't have a permanent job. So I have a 5-year rolling contract, which means that every year I am assessed on performance, and then they assess what I was able to do with the resources I was given. And if that assessment is favorable, then one more year get added at the end of the 5. So I always have 5 years ahead of me, which allows me to take risk, allows me to explore and also engage in curiosity-driven research, which most people cannot afford doing, in as long as I deliver. And well, if I have a bad year 1 year, then my buffer gets cut down to 4 years. But so far, that hasn't been the case in the 10 years that I've been here. And I've been able to do the most free and creative research that I've done in my entire career, exploring other fields. So I've been publishing quite a bit on biomedicine. I've been publishing quite a bit on photonics and a lot of other fields outside marine
Right.
science, but where I have learned something from the ocean that can offer solutions in other fields.
Right, right. And we'll be touching on some of those papers. But before we get to those, let's talk about your role as executive director in 2021 Global Car R&D Accelerator platform, and we'll put the link to the strategic plan, which is quite extensive as a
Yeah,
43-page document. But in this document are a list of priorities, which basically cover a lot of what we've been talking about, everything from R&D in terms of coral, coral restoration, protection, scale-up solutions to transition things to the blue economy, and a long list of everything else. And again, I'll put the link so everyone that's listening and watching can read it. Talk a little bit about CORDAP, what's going on, some of the high-level priorities, which you outline here, and take your time with this one because I think it's important.
Yeah, so I think one important milestone in my research career is that by the turn of the century and the first years of this century, I was not very optimistic about the future of the ocean because I was seeing a lot of loss and a lot of damage. But then something happened around 2010. In fact, around the Malaspina expedition, I started to see not only with my own experience sampling the global ocean, but also news coming from many corners of the ocean that hinted or very clearly reported a rebound of marine life. And then these news were so diverse and so synchronous that I then thought that something was going on in the ocean, and I started to look deeper into what is going on and why are those species rebounding and those good news starting to come from different corners of the ocean. Those news were news that are not celebrated in the global media, which typically bombard us with the negativity and the doom and gloom. So they're kind of hidden, but they were hidden that for the careful observer that is very, very closely looking at the ocean, then you could start seeing that something was going on. So what was going on is that in the 1980s, different policies were introduced of global reach that were starting to deliver their benefits like 30 years later. So that includes the International Whaling Commission ban on whale hunting, then includes the International Convention for the Trade of Endangered Species that regulated the trade and went a long ways into mitigating poaching and illegal hunting of marine species, and even the Clean Air Act of the US, which was never intended to generate benefits in the ocean, but mandated a replacement of leaded with unleaded fuels. That lead from the fuel was the main source of lead pollution to the ocean. And during the Malaspina expedition, then we found and we published, although I think very few people know about this, that the ocean lead levels had come back to normal, and they had come back to the normal baseline, actually as an outcome of phasing out leaded fuel. So a number of things that had been done on the policy space, sometimes not even thinking in the ocean, had actually led to major benefits and enabled that rebound of life in the ocean. So I collected all of those observations and thoughts into a paper published in the journal Nature called Rebuilding Marine Life, which first showed that provided scientific evidence that it's possible to rebuild the abundance of life in the oceans and provided a roadmap on how to do that. But then also showed that coral reefs are the most vulnerable components of all of the ocean inhabitants, and the one where the risk of failure in trying to rebuild their abundance was greatest. So also in that year, 2020, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was presiding on the G20, and they were trying to source ideas to put forward to the G20 partners to be able to have a legacy, and then a program to fast track our capacity to conserve and restore coral reefs. I proposed that program, and that was eventually adopted by the G20 members. And in 2021, we launched the platform. In fact, since 2021, the problem has become more acute. So on the last year, since June 2023, the world has been consistently every month at more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels of temperature, which translate into an ocean 1 degree warmer than average, and very severe heat waves in the ocean that have really led to a massive global mortality of corals of an unprecedented nature. So our mission to be able to deliver the tools to enable corals to continue to thrive in the ocean is more urgent now than ever.
What we talked about the blue economy, and I don't know if you were you at Oceans 2023 in Panama, because I know you were on uh I guess the preliminary agenda, and that because I know there was a lot
Yeah.
of folks there, Josh Tewksbury from the Smithsonian and President Whips from Palau. I know you're supposed to be on a panel, but were you there in 2023?
I was, as you indicated in the agenda, but unfortunately, due to a family
Ah,
emergency, I had to pull out, and I was unable to join the conference at the end. But I was listed as a speaker indeed.
right. Okay. Okay. Well, nonetheless, I would still, I would still love to get because you were supposed to be on you're supposed to be on a panel called the Blue Economy: Building Better Opportunities, and again, this outlines sort of broadly, as you were mentioning, how many, what percent of the global population is reliant on the ocean for incomes, and ultimately where this is all evolving. What, aside from I guess the high value products that we talked about, whether it's the pharmaceuticals, industrial chemicals, whatever, other areas of the blue economy that
Mm.
whether they're things we extract from it or I'm thinking in terms of what Dr. Tester's
Yeah,
group is doing in terms
yeah,
of saltwater agriculture, either growing things in the
yeah.
ocean or growing things on the land with saltwater.
Well,
uh
yeah.
what other areas of the blue economy get you kind of
Yeah.
excited when you
So
think
that's
about them?
precisely one of the areas, what you mentioned, which I call blue superfoods.
Yeah.
And I define blue superfoods as foods from oceans that are healthy for people and healthy for the oceans.
Yeah.
So that kind of departs a bit from the standard way of sourcing food from ocean, which is harvesting, or practicing aquaculture, which is a relatively new industry in ways that generate impacts on the ocean. So blue superfoods have to be also affordable to all because we are at the doorsteps of an imminent global food crisis. So the number of people at severe risk of starvation has doubled, and then climate impacts on either droughts, floods, and other impacts are leading to a massive failure of crops. We see that in the developed world, we see that as inflation. So every time we go to the supermarket, it's a bit more expensive. But in developing nations, that is already leading to famines and starvation. So the only way to secure a food security is actually the ocean, and to do that through blue superfoods. So we need to also consider that the food from ocean carries the lowest carbon footprint of any food
Hmm.
system. In fact, some crops are climate positive, like seaweed farming. Not only carries no emissions, but actually contributes to sequestering carbon.
Yeah.
Not only is a matter of carbon footprints, but also there's no water footprint, because one of the key drivers of stress on the food system is the lack of reliable water sources to continue to produce food. On the ocean, we don't have any problem with food security, so there's a zero freshwater footprint on food source from ocean. There's zero chemical footprint because we don't use chemical fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides. So then the food system from the ocean needs to be integrated with the food system from land to be able to not only multiply the amount of volume of food that we can produce, but do it in a way that is free from the impacts that massive food systems on land had had. In fact, right now we are hosting COP16 of the Land Degradation Convention of the UN in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. So on Monday, I'm running a session entitled Triple Wins and How Addressing Land Degradation Can Generate Benefits on Biodiversity and Climate Challenges. So then looking at the ocean provides solutions for all of those challenges. But so far, we have not looked at the ocean sufficiently as a food system that can, in a sustainable way, deliver healthy food for humans. So that is a new essential pillar of the blue economy. And the last pillar is a renewable energy from oceans.
Right.
Right now, we are harvesting already a lot of energy from offshore wind farms. I believe they're now controversial a bit in the US, but in the EU, there's a massive deployment of offshore wind farms across the coastal zone in the EU, but beyond wind, which actually is not marine energy, but is energy harvested above the ocean, then harvesting energy from waves and tides, and even the thermal structure of the ocean could really alleviate our energy needs and could really fast track and nearly infinite source of renewable energy. So we are starting to explore these new pillars of the new blue economy, but the assessment is that they can triple the benefits that we receive from the oceans to the global economy and do that in a regenerative way.
Excellent. Really excellent. Carlos, one other thing while I have you today, I just got to ask about this paper because you mentioned, some of the areas that you don't normally get a chance to explore. But in June of 2023, you put out the Nature Biotechnology Perspectives article entitled "Wearable Sensors for Monitoring Marine Environments and Their Inhabitants." And in this paper, you propose a so-called Internet of Marine Life that ultimately could contribute to more robust and effective observation systems for both the ocean and commercial aquaculture operations. Say a couple words about Internet of Marine Life involving wearables would look like. That sounds kind of cool.
Yeah. So KAUST, King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, put forward a KAUST sensor initiative in 2015, actually, when I joined. And that was a very ambitious program to partner with the top institutions in the world working on the sensor revolution to fast track sensor development. So at that time, it was the type with wearables were already coming forward, and there was a lot of new innovations on sensor technology. But at the same time, the sensors that we were using for ocean sensing continue to feel and look very much like the sensors I used 30 years ago. So sensor technology development for oceans was stagnant. And then I gathered a group of gurus working on electronics, signal processing, energy, and so on to develop new sensors for the ocean. And the essence is that we were going to develop wearables for marine life. So my colleagues were initially excited because they usually don't get to work with marine animals like turtles, dolphins, and so on. And they soon discovered that the challenge that I had presented with was a lot more profound than they realized initially. Because when you start to thinking about transferring wearables into the submarine environment, first of all, it's a conductive environment, so that for electricity, so it's very hard to work with electricity in the ocean. Then also it's very difficult to enable communication with the usual signals that we use on land because they have very, very short ranges on the ocean. Then third, there's a problem with pressure that we don't know about when we do wearables on land. And also microbes thrive in the surfaces of anything you put underwater. So they immediately found that the challenge was massive. And then, but then again, they're very creative engineers. So we worked together to derive a series of very revolutionary sensors, like, for instance, silicon sensors printed on flexible silicon that we call marine skin, that can be attached to the bodies of marine organisms, anywhere from small crabs to large mammals and fish, and that they can adapt to the motion of the animal and even grow and stretch.
Right.
And then we also stumbled into a new material that I believe we were the first ones to develop a sensor based on this material, but now it is really a very promising material for all kinds of applications, which is graphene. Because we discovered that graphene is not vulnerable to fouling of organisms. So for some reason that we don't know really the basis of, microbial films do not grow on graphene. So they remain free of that growth, and they have amazing properties. So we found that graphene is really an amazing material to base the sensor revolution. And we designed a wearable sensor based on graphene that was measuring flow for organisms as they moved. And then serendipitously, then McLaren the Formula One team were visiting KAUST, and we showed them some of the work that we were doing, and they were really interested in the flow sensor that we developed from graphene. And now those sensors are printed on the bodies of the McLaren Formula One cars that carry the logo Biodiversity. So it went from marine life into Formula One cars.
No, that's amazing. And you got me thinking when you talked about biofouling. I remember years ago looking at those numbers, and that's an amazing setup, financial, just to thinking about if you just were able to clean up or prevent the biofouling on the ships that
Yeah, no, we
circumnavigate
were
the
able.
globe.
The challenge still with graphene is that
Yeah,
I think it's about 20 years after the discovery of the material, then we still don't have a process that is able to fabricate graphene at scale in a cost-effective way.
yeah,
If that was possible, then we can cover with just a one atom thick layer the
right,
hulls vessels, and we will never have to paint them again with
right.
toxic anti-fouling paints.
Right, right. Yeah, I remember this now. For some reason I briefly had to study this, and yeah, it was an amazing number. I mean, it was like in the trillions or so. It was some crazy number that you could
Yeah, it
save.
is.
But no, that's nice to hear. It's a fabulous body of work. You mentioned COP16 in Riyadh is going on. I think it started already. If I'm
Yeah,
not
started on the
mistaken.
second.
Right.
Yeah.
What else is happening that we should know about as we get into 2025? I mean, we touched on a lot of things, but anything as we get into the new year, other conferences, programs,
Yeah.
any publicly facing stuff related to CORDAP, anything else you want to talk about, please take the floor.
So the most important milestone for oceans in 2025 is going to be, in terms of events, it is going to be the UN Ocean Conference that will take place in Nice, France, in June 2025.
Okay.
And this will be the third time that the UN organized calls for a conference on oceans, and the co-presidents are the governments of France and Costa Rica. And then there's going to be a lot of momentum building towards that conference. And in addition to the formal UN process, that is going to be preceded by a congress called One Ocean Congress
Hmm.
that will review the status of marine science and the new results of marine science. There's going to be also a Blue Economy forum, finance forum, that will happen just before the opening of UNOC. And then there's also going to be a huge involvement of civil society through arts and culture to contribute to oceans. So this time, rather than just have conversations and be an opportunity to network, there is an aspiration that there will be something that will be something like a Paris Agreement for the oceans. I think it
Mm.
probably will be something below that, but there is the expectation, the ambition to have tangible outcomes in terms of policy processes that will roll from UNOC, which is the acronym for this conference. And in terms of corals, as a response to the devastating loss of corals in the last year, where the losses have been massive, but they have also done away with much of the investments in restoration that have been deployed for corals in the US, in the Caribbean, and elsewhere. Then I'm starting to work on organizing a very small conference called Corals Under Crisis to mobilize society, policymakers, environmental managers, funders, and the financial world to fast track that solution, because we were talking earlier about the promise of the blue marine genes and blue biotechnology. So it turns
Right.
out that one in every four resources come from coral reefs, and
Mm.
we're now just starting to explore them. So the loss of coral reefs is not just a loss of beauty, it's also biodiversity, but it's also a huge loss of potential sources of revenue and economy to solve problems in society in the future.
Um, yeah, I mean, an amazing program, set of programs, amazing career, and I wish you, Carlos, the best with it, with you and your team and the program at KAUST. And I'm rooting you on from here on the East Coast of the United States. But really amazing work. For everybody, again, that is going to be listening to this episode of our show across the podcast networks or watching on our YouTube channel, again, you've been spending time with Professor Carlos Duarte, Distinguished Professor Marine Sciences, Executive Director, Coral Research and Development Accelerator Program, King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, doing really amazing things to grow the blue economy and ultimately develop these nature-based solutions to deal with these major global challenges. Carlos, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us for a little while, to educate us on these matters. Thank you for everything you do. And as we say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for billions of people around the world via what you're working on. Really a great story.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope the audience enjoys the conversation too.
Great having you.